The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as 8-year-old Prince George walked down the grand corridor, his small footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor. It was early December 2021, and the castle buzzed with Christmas preparations. Servants hurried past carrying garlands of holly and ivy, while the sweet scent of cinnamon and nutmeg drifted from the royal kitchens. George had been looking for his great-grandmother all morning. Queen Elizabeth II, now 95 years old, had promised him something special today, though she had been mysteriously quiet about what exactly they would be doing together. The young prince had already searched the drawing rooms, the library, and even peeked in her private study, but found no sign of her. As he rounded the corner near the state apartments, he heard familiar voices coming from an unexpected direction. Following the sound, George found himself approaching the royal kitchens, a place he rarely visited. The voices grew clearer, and he recognized his great-grandmother's distinct tone, though it seemed different somehow, more relaxed and animated than usual. Pushing open the heavy kitchen door, George discovered Queen Elizabeth standing at a massive wooden table, wearing a simple blue dress covered by a floral apron that looked quite ordinary compared to her usual formal attire. Her gray hair was neatly styled as always, but there was a sparkle in her eyes that suggested mischief. Around her, the kitchen staff worked quietly at their various tasks, giving the queen respectful space while remaining close enough to assist if needed. "Ah, there you are, George," the queen said, looking up with a warm smile. "I was beginning to wonder if you had forgotten our appointment." George approached cautiously, taking in the unusual scene. The kitchen table was covered with an array of ingredients he had never seen assembled together before. There were bowls of dried fruits in deep reds and golden yellows, containers of nuts, bottles of what appeared to be spirits, and various spices that filled the air with rich, exotic aromas. "What we doing, Gongon?" George asked, using his private nickname for his great-grandmother. His eyes were wide with curiosity as he examined the colorful display before them. Queen Elizabeth chuckled softly, the sound carrying decades of warmth and affection. "Today, my dear boy, we're going to make Christmas pudding. Not just any Christmas pudding, but the one that will grace our table on Christmas Day. This has been a royal tradition for longer than you might imagine." George's face lit up with excitement, though he looked somewhat puzzled. "But don't the cooks usually make all our food?" "Indeed they do, and they do it magnificently," the queen replied, gesturing toward the kitchen staff, who beamed with pride at the compliment. "But Christmas pudding is different. It is a tradition that connects us to our family's past and to families across Britain. For many years, I have made the Christmas pudding myself, and I thought it was time to pass this knowledge on to you." The head chef, a distinguished gentleman named Chef Morrison who had served the royal family for over 20 years, approached with a gentle smile. "Your Majesty has been making the royal Christmas pudding for more than 40 years. It is truly an honor to witness this tradition being shared." George looked between his great-grandmother and the chef, beginning to understand that this was something far more significant than he had initially realized. "Will you teach me everything, Gongon?" "Every single step," Queen Elizabeth confirmed, rolling up her sleeves with the practiced motion of someone who was no stranger to kitchen work. "But first, you must understand the story behind what we are about to do." As the queen began to explain, George listened with rapt attention. She told him how Christmas pudding had been a British tradition for centuries, how it was once called plum pudding even though it contained no plums, and how each family had their own secret recipe passed down through generations. She explained that the royal family's recipe was particularly special, having been refined and perfected over many decades. "The most important thing to remember," the queen continued, "is that Christmas pudding cannot be rushed. It requires patience, care, and attention to detail. These are qualities that will serve you well not just in cooking, but in all aspects of your life." George nodded seriously, understanding that this lesson extended far beyond the kitchen. He had often heard his parents and grandparents speak about duty, service, and attention to detail, but Here was his great-grandmother showing him these principles in a tangible, hands-on way. Chef Morrison had quietly prepared a smaller workstation for George, complete with a step stool, so he could reach the table comfortably, and child-sized utensils that would be easier for his small hands to manage. The attention to detail impressed George, who was beginning to realize that this had been planned carefully in advance. "Now then," Queen Elizabeth said, clapping her hands together softly, "let us begin with the most important ingredient of all." She reached for a large ceramic bowl and placed it in the center of their workspace. This bowl has been used for the royal Christmas pudding for over 30 years. It was a gift from the people of Stoke-on-Trent, famous for their pottery, and I have treasured it ever since. George examined the bowl carefully, noting its simple elegance and the way it seemed to glow in the warm kitchen light. "It's beautiful, gun. But what's the most important ingredient you mentioned?" Queen Elizabeth smiled mysteriously and pointed to her heart. "Love, my dear George. Love for our family, love for our traditions, and love for all the people who will share this pudding with us on Christmas Day. Without love, it is merely a mixture of ingredients. With love, it becomes something magical." The young prince considered this carefully, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. He had grown up understanding that his family was different, that they had special responsibilities and traditions, but this moment helped him see these obligations in a new light. They were not burdens to be carried, but gifts to be treasured and shared. As they prepared to begin the actual cooking process, Queen Elizabeth explained each ingredient and its significance. The dried fruits represented the bounty of the Commonwealth, sourced from various nations that formed part of their extended family. The spices told stories of ancient trade routes and cultural exchange. Even the brandy had a tale, having been selected from a distillery that held a royal warrant. "Every ingredient has been chosen not just for its flavor," the Queen explained, "but for what it represents. When we eat this pudding on Christmas Day, we are celebrating not just our immediate family, but our connection to people and places around the world." George found himself captivated by these stories, understanding for the first time how something as simple as a Christmas dessert could carry such deep meaning and history. As he looked around the kitchen, seeing the careful preparations and the expectant faces of the staff, he realized he was about to become part of something much larger than himself. The Queen picked up a wooden spoon, its handle worn smooth by years of use, and offered it to George. "This spoon has stirred many royal Christmas puddings. Today, it begins a new chapter in its story, just as you begin a new chapter in yours." Taking the spoon with both hands, George felt the weight of tradition settling gently on his young shoulders. It was not the heavy burden he might have expected, but something warm and comforting like being wrapped in a familiar blanket on a cold winter's day. "Are you ready to begin, Prince George?" Queen Elizabeth asked formally, though her eyes twinkled with affection. "Yes, gone." George replied with growing confidence. "I'm ready to learn." And so, as the winter morning progressed, and the kitchen filled with the warmth of their shared purpose, the Queen and her great-grandson began what would become one of George's most treasured memories, though neither of them knew it at the time. They were simply a great-grandmother and her beloved great-grandson connected by love, tradition, and the timeless magic of creating something beautiful together. Queen Elizabeth reached for the first container of dried fruit, her movements deliberate and practiced. "We shall start with the sultanas," she announced, opening a large jar filled with plump, golden raisins that seemed to glow in the kitchen light. "These particular sultanas come from Australia, where the sunshine creates the sweetest fruit you can imagine." George watched as his great-grandmother measured out exactly 2 cups of the sultanas into a smaller bowl. Her movements were precise, yet there was something almost meditative about the way she worked. "Why do we need to be so exact with the measurements? Gone. Excellence, my dear boy, lies in the details," the Queen replied, handing George the measuring cup. "A recipe is like a promise. When we follow it faithfully, we honor not only the tradition, but also everyone who will taste our creation. Now, you try measuring the currants." The young prince took the measuring cup carefully, determined to match his great-grandmother's precision. The currants were smaller and darker than the sultanas, and, as he scooped them up, a few scattered onto the wooden table. Instead of being frustrated, George methodically picked up each escaped currant and placed it back in the bowl. "Very good," Queen Elizabeth observed approvingly. "You understand that every ingredient matters, no matter how small it might seem." Chef Morrison, who had been watching from a respectful distance, stepped forward with a damp cloth to clean any remaining fruit from the table. "Your Majesty, shall I prepare the chopping station for the candied peel?" "Please do, Morrison. And perhaps you could show Prince George the proper way to hold a knife." George's eyes widened with excitement. He had never been allowed to use a proper kitchen knife before, and this felt like a significant step toward grown-up responsibilities. Chef Morrison approached with a smaller knife, its blade sharp but manageable for careful young hands. "The most important thing about using a knife safely," Chef Morrison explained, demonstrating the proper grip, "is to always cut away from yourself and to keep your fingers curved like this." He showed George how to position his free hand, creating a bridge over the food being cut. The candied orange peel had been delivered fresh that morning from a specialty shop in London that had supplied the royal family for over a century. It arrived in neat strips, translucent and jewel-like, with a fragrance that immediately transported George to memories of Christmas mornings past. "This candied peel," Queen Elizabeth explained as George carefully made his first cuts under Chef Morrison's watchful eye, "requires patience to make properly. The oranges are slowly cooked in sugar syrup over many hours until they become these beautiful pieces. It reminds us that the best things in life cannot be rushed." George concentrated intensely on his cutting, making small, even pieces as he had been shown. The work required more focus than he had anticipated, and he began to understand why his great-grandmother spoke of patience and attention to detail. Each piece needed to be roughly the same size to ensure even distribution throughout the pudding. "This is harder than it looks," George admitted, pausing to wipe his brow with the back of his hand. Queen Elizabeth chuckled warmly. "Most worthwhile things are, George. But look at what you have accomplished already." She gestured to his growing pile of neatly cut peel. "Each piece is perfect because you took the time to do it properly." As they worked, the Queen began sharing stories of Christmas celebrations from her own childhood. She told George about making Christmas pudding with her mother, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, and how even during the difficult years of World War II, they had maintained this tradition as a symbol of hope and continuity. During the war, she said, her voice taking on a reflective tone, many ingredients were scarce. We had to be creative, sometimes using carrots instead of some of the dried fruits, and we were grateful for whatever brandy we could find. But we never stopped making Christmas pudding. It represented our faith that better times would come. George paused in his cutting to listen more carefully. He had learned about the war in his studies, but hearing his great-grandmother speak about it in such personal terms made it feel more real and immediate. "Were you scared during the war, gone?" "Sometimes," the Queen replied honestly. "But fear is natural, George. Courage is not the absence of fear, but doing what is right despite being afraid." Making Christmas pudding during those difficult times was our small act of courage, our way of saying that we would not let circumstances destroy our joy or our traditions. This conversation gave George a new understanding of his great-grandmother's character. He had always known she was important and respected, but now he saw her as someone who had faced real challenges and found strength through maintaining traditions like the one they were sharing now. Chef Morrison returned with a selection of nuts, already carefully shelled and sorted. There were almonds, walnuts, and Brazil nuts, each variety chosen for its specific contribution to the pudding's texture and flavor. "Shall we prepare the nuts next, Your Majesty?" "Indeed. George, would you like to choose which nuts to chop first?" George examined the three varieties carefully, noting their different sizes, colors, and textures. The almonds, he decided. They're the prettiest. "An excellent choice," Queen Elizabeth agreed. "And beauty in food is important. We eat with our eyes first, then with our taste buds. As George worked on chopping the almonds, he noticed that his great-grandmother had moved on to preparing the breadcrumbs. She was grating day-old bread with a large metal grater, creating fine, even crumbs that would help bind all the ingredients together. The bread must be exactly 1 day old, she explained, noticing George's curious gaze. Fresh bread creates heavy crumbs, while bread that is too old becomes dusty. 1 day old gives us the perfect texture. How do you know all these things, Gongon? George asked, genuinely impressed by the depth of knowledge required for what he had assumed was a simple recipe. Experience, my dear boy. 70 years of making Christmas pudding teaches you quite a lot. But more than that, I learned from watching my mother, just as you're learning from watching me. Knowledge passes from one generation to the next, like a treasured gift that grows more valuable with each sharing. The kitchen had grown warmer as their work progressed, filled with the mingled aromas of dried fruits, candied peel, and nuts. George found the atmosphere incredibly comforting, so different from the formal settings where he usually spent time with his great-grandmother. Here, she seemed more relaxed, more like the loving family member he knew her to be rather than the dignified monarch the world saw. Now comes my favorite part, Queen Elizabeth announced, reaching for a large bottle of brandy. But this is strictly for the adults to handle. She carefully measured out a generous portion of the brandy and began drizzling it over the mixed fruits. The rich, warm smell of the alcohol mixed with the fruit created an intoxicating aroma that spoke of celebration and festivity. The brandy does two things, she explained to George. First, it adds flavor that develops and mellows as the pudding ages. Second, it helps preserve the pudding so it can be stored for several weeks before Christmas Day. George watched as the fruits absorbed the brandy, their colors deepening and becoming more lustrous. Does the alcohol disappear when we cook it? Much of it does, but some remains to give the pudding its characteristic flavor. This is why Christmas pudding is considered a treat for special occasions. As they mixed the brandy-soaked fruits, Queen Elizabeth began humming softly, a Christmas carol that George recognized but couldn't quite name. Her voice was gentle and melodious, and soon George found himself humming along, creating a moment of pure contentment in the busy kitchen. The morning was progressing beautifully, and George realized that he was not just learning to make Christmas pudding, but discovering something precious about his family's history and his own place within it. Each ingredient, each careful measurement, each story his great-grandmother shared was weaving him more deeply into the tapestry of royal tradition, while creating brand new memories that would last him a lifetime. The mixing process required a much larger bowl, and Chef Morrison wheeled over a massive ceramic vessel that looked ancient and well-used. Queen Elizabeth smiled when she saw it, running her hand along its smooth rim with obvious affection. "This bowl belonged to my great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria," she told George, her voice filled with reverence. "She used it for making Christmas pudding at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight." Imagine, George, the hands that have touched this bowl, the Christmas celebrations it has witnessed. George approached the historic bowl with newfound respect, understanding that he was about to become part of a story that stretched back over 150 years. The weight of this realization was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming for an 8-year-old boy. "May I touch it, Gongon?" he asked softly. "Of course, dear. You are part of this family story now, just as much as any of us who came before." As George's small hands explored the smooth ceramic surface, Queen Elizabeth began adding the wet ingredients to their dry mixture. Fresh eggs, creamy milk, and a generous portion of beef suet went into the bowl, each addition carefully measured and explained. "The suet might seem unusual," the Queen noted, observing George's slightly puzzled expression as she added the white, fatty pieces, "but it is essential for the proper texture. As the pudding steams for hours, the suet melts and creates pockets of richness throughout. Without it, we would have a dense, heavy cake rather than a light, moist pudding." George nodded, accepting this explanation, though he privately thought the raw suet looked rather unappetizing. He was beginning to understand that cooking sometimes required faith in the process, trusting that ingredients would transform in magical ways during cooking. Now, Queen Elizabeth announced with ceremony, comes the most important part of all, the mixing. She handed George a massive wooden spoon, its handle worn smooth by decades of use. Tradition holds that every member of the family should stir the pudding mixture, making a wish while stirring from east to west in honor of the wise men who traveled to visit the baby Jesus. George grasped the spoon with both hands, finding it heavier than expected. The mixture in the bowl was thick and rich, filled with beautiful colors and textures from all the ingredients they had prepared together. As he began to stir, moving carefully from east to west as instructed, he closed his eyes and made his wish. Queen Elizabeth watched him with obvious pleasure, and when he finished, she asked, "Would you like to know what I always wish for when I stir the Christmas pudding?" "Yes, please," George replied, genuinely curious. "I wish for peace and happiness for all the people in our Commonwealth, and for wisdom to serve them well in the year to come. I wish that our family remains strong and united, and that traditions like this one continue to connect us to each other and to our history." George considered this thoughtfully as his great-grandmother took her turn with the spoon. Her movements were confident and practiced, and she stirred much longer than he had, lost in her own thoughts and wishes. When she finished, her eyes were bright with emotion. Gone," George said quietly. "I wish that you would always be happy, and that I would grow up to be as good and kind as you are." The Queen paused in her movements, clearly touched by his sweet sentiment. "That is a beautiful wish, George. And you know what? I believe it will come true, because you already show signs of becoming a wonderful young man." Chef Morrison, who had been discreetly observing from across the kitchen, approached with the special pudding cloth that would be used for steaming. It was pristine white cotton, large enough to completely envelop the pudding, and had been boiled earlier that morning to ensure it was perfectly clean. "The cloth must be floured properly," Queen Elizabeth explained, demonstrating how to dust the fabric with plain flour until it was evenly coated. "This prevents the pudding from sticking and gives it a beautiful, smooth surface when it is turned out." George watched as she carefully spooned the thick mixture into the center of the prepared cloth. The pudding looked like a rich, dark treasure, studded with jewel-like fruits and nuts. The aroma was intoxicating, promising wonderful flavors to come. "Now we must gather the cloth carefully and tie it securely," the Queen continued, showing George how to bring the corners together without squeezing the pudding too tightly. "The pudding needs room to expand slightly as it cooks, but the cloth must be secure enough to hold everything together during the long steaming process." The tying of the pudding cloth was more complex than George had anticipated. Queen Elizabeth demonstrated the special knot that would hold firm during hours of steaming, while still allowing for easy removal when the pudding was cooked. George tried to follow her movements, but his attempt resulted in a rather lopsided bundle. "Practice makes perfect," the Queen said kindly, gently undoing George's knot and reading it properly. "I have been tying pudding cloth for 70 years, so you must not expect to master it immediately." Chef Morrison had been preparing the large steaming pot, a massive vessel that dominated one corner of the kitchen. Steam rose from the boiling water inside, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and activity. "We are ready for the pudding, Your Majesty." Carrying the wrapped pudding together, Queen Elizabeth and George approached the steaming pot. The moment felt ceremonial, marking the transition from preparation to cooking, from raw ingredients to the beginning of transformation. "The pudding will steam for 6 hours today," the Queen explained as Chef Morrison carefully lowered their creation into the pot. "Then it will rest and mature for several weeks before we steam it again on Christmas morning. This long process allows all the flavors to blend and develop into something truly special." George watched as the pudding disappeared beneath the surface of the boiling water, the cloth billowing slightly as it settled into place. 6 whole hours? What do we do now?" "Now we wait," Queen Elizabeth replied with a smile. "Patience is perhaps the most important ingredient in Christmas pudding. But While we wait, we can clean our workspace and prepare a special lunch together. I thought you might enjoy learning to make Welsh rarebit, another family favorite. As they began clearing away the pudding-making equipment, George reflected on the morning's activities. He had learned so much more than just how to make Christmas pudding. He had discovered stories about his family's history, understood the importance of tradition and continuity, and gained a new appreciation for the careful work that went into creating something beautiful and lasting. The kitchen staff worked efficiently around them, washing bowls and utensils while maintaining the respectful distance they always showed when Queen Elizabeth was working personally in their domain. George noticed how they moved with quiet pride, clearly honored to witness this royal tradition in action. Gone, George said as they finished organizing their workspace. Will you teach me to make other things too? I like learning about all the ingredients and their stories. Queen Elizabeth's face lit up with genuine pleasure. I will be delighted to, George. Cooking is about much more than food, you know. It is about caring for others, preserving traditions, and creating memories that last a lifetime. I have a feeling you have a natural talent for all of these things. As the morning turned to afternoon and the pudding began its long, slow transformation in the steaming pot, George felt a deep sense of accomplishment and connection. He was no longer just a young prince learning about his future responsibilities, but a beloved great-grandson who had been welcomed into one of his family's most cherished traditions. The kitchen, filled with warmth and wonderful aromas, had become a place where past and future met in perfect harmony, creating memories that would influence the rest of his life. 3 weeks later, George bounded into Windsor Castle with unusual excitement, still wearing his school blazer and carrying his backpack. It was December 23rd, and his parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, had driven him directly from school to spend Christmas with his great-grandmother. But George had one particular destination in mind that had nothing to do with Christmas presents or holiday festivities. Gone, he called out as he searched the familiar corridors. Gone. Is it time to check our pudding? Queen Elizabeth emerged from a morning room with a warm smile, dressed in her customary pearls and a festive red dress that seemed perfect for the occasion. George, my dear boy. Yes, indeed it is time. I have been looking forward to this moment almost as much as you have. The Queen had been monitoring their Christmas pudding carefully throughout its aging process, checking it weekly to ensure it was developing properly. She had explained to George during his previous visits that the brandy and natural fruit sugars would gradually transform the pudding, creating deeper flavors and a richer texture with each passing day. Has it changed much since we made it? George asked eagerly as they walked toward the kitchen together. Let us discover that together, the Queen replied mysteriously. Part of the magic is seeing how our creation has transformed over time. In the kitchen, Chef Morrison was waiting with obvious anticipation. The royal Christmas pudding had been stored in a cool pantry, wrapped carefully in fresh cloth, and checked regularly. Today would reveal whether their efforts had produced the perfect result. Chef Morrison tells me that our pudding has been behaving beautifully, Queen Elizabeth informed George. No signs of spoilage, and the aroma when he checked it last week was absolutely divine. George felt a flutter of nervous excitement in his stomach. So much depended on this moment. Had they measured correctly? Had the mixture been properly balanced? Would their pudding be worthy of the royal Christmas table? Chef Morrison carefully unwrapped the aged pudding, removing the outer cloth with practiced precision. As the final layer was peeled away, a magnificent dark pudding was revealed, its surface glossy and rich, studded with visible fruits and nuts that seemed to glow like precious gems. Oh, gun. George gasped. It's beautiful. It looks completely different from when we put it away. Indeed, the pudding had transformed dramatically. What had been a somewhat rough mixture of ingredients had become a unified, elegant creation. The color had deepened to a rich, dark brown, and the surface had a lustrous quality that spoke of perfectly balanced moisture and flavor development. Queen Elizabeth leaned forward to examine their creation closely, and George watched her face anxiously for signs of approval. Her expression grew more pleased as she studied the pudding from different angles, noting its color, texture, and aroma. "George," she said finally, "this may be one of the finest Christmas puddings I have ever made. Look at how evenly the fruits are distributed, how perfectly the color has developed. We should be very proud of our work." Relief and pride flooded through George in equal measure. He had worried during the past 3 weeks that he might have made some crucial error, but now he could see that their pudding was indeed something special. "But how do we know if it tastes right?" he asked practically. "Ah," Queen Elizabeth said with a twinkle in her eye, "that requires the traditional Christmas pudding test. We must take a small sample to ensure the flavors have developed properly." Chef Morrison produced a sharp knife and carefully cut a small wedge from one side of the pudding. The interior was revealed to be beautifully moist and evenly textured, with fruits and nuts distributed throughout like a rich mosaic. The aroma that escaped was incredible, warm and spicy and festive. "The moment of truth," the Queen announced, cutting the sample into 2 small pieces. "Shall we taste our creation, George?" George accepted his portion with slightly trembling hands. This felt like the most important taste test of his life. He placed a small piece in his mouth and chewed thoughtfully, his expression serious and concentrated. The flavor was extraordinary. All the individual ingredients they had so carefully prepared had melded into something far greater than the sum of its parts. The brandy had mellowed into a warm, complex background note, while the fruits provided bursts of sweetness balanced by the nuts' earthy richness. The spices created a warm, festive sensation that immediately brought to mind Christmas mornings and family gatherings. "It's perfect, gone," George said with genuine awe. "It tastes like Christmas itself." Queen Elizabeth smiled with obvious satisfaction as she savored her own sample. "Indeed it does, George. We have created something truly special together. This pudding will be the centerpiece of our Christmas dinner tomorrow." Chef Morrison, who had been given permission to taste a small sample as well, nodded approvingly. "Your Majesty, this is exceptional work. The texture is ideal, and the flavor balance is absolutely perfect. Prince George should be very proud of his contribution." George beamed with pride, understanding for the first time what it felt like to create something beautiful and lasting with his own hands. The weeks of anticipation had been worth every moment of waiting. "Now," Queen Elizabeth continued, "we must prepare our pudding for its final steaming tomorrow. On Christmas morning, we will steam it for another 2 hours to warm it through and complete the cooking process." George watched as Chef Morrison carefully rewrapped the pudding in fresh cloth, preparing it for its final transformation. Tomorrow, this creation of theirs would feed the entire royal family gathered for Christmas dinner, carrying with it all the love and tradition they had invested in its making. Gone," George said thoughtfully. "Will you teach me to make other special things for our family? I like knowing that I helped create something that makes people happy." "Nothing would give me greater pleasure," Queen Elizabeth replied warmly. "You have shown real talent and dedication, George. More importantly, you understand that cooking for others is an act of love and service. These are qualities that will serve you well throughout your life, whether you're making Christmas pudding or fulfilling your duties as a member of our family." As they left the kitchen together, George felt a profound sense of accomplishment and connection. He was no longer just a young prince who happened to be related to the Queen, but someone who had actively participated in preserving and continuing an important family tradition. Tomorrow, when the family gathered around the dinner table and tasted their Christmas pudding, he would know that he had contributed something meaningful to their celebration. The castle around them hummed with final Christmas preparations, but George carried with him the quiet satisfaction that comes from patient work well done. He had learned that the most meaningful achievements often require time, attention to detail, and faith in the process, lessons that would serve him well far beyond the kitchen walls. Christmas Day dawned crisp and bright at Windsor Castle, with frost glittering on the windows and the promise of snow in the gray winter sky. George woke early not from excitement about presents, but from eager anticipation of the Christmas dinner that would feature their homemade pudding as the grand finale. By 10 o'clock in the morning, George had already dressed in his best Christmas outfit and made his way to the kitchen to check on the final preparations. Queen Elizabeth was there before him, wearing an elegant emerald green dress with her favorite sapphire brooch, but she had once again donned a simple apron to protect her clothing. "Good morning, my dear George," she greeted him warmly. "Are you ready to complete our Christmas pudding journey?" "I've been thinking about this moment for weeks," George admitted honestly. "I dreamed about it last night." Chef Morrison and his team were bustling around the kitchen in organized preparation for the elaborate Christmas feast that would feed 32 members of the royal family and their guests. Despite the controlled chaos around them, Queen Elizabeth and George had been given their familiar workspace near the large steaming pot. "The final steaming is just as important as everything else we have done," Queen Elizabeth explained as they carefully unwrapped their aged pudding. 2 hours at a gentle, steady temperature will warm it through completely and give the flavors their final integration. George marveled again at how magnificent their pudding looked after its weeks of aging. If anything, it seemed even more beautiful than it had during their tasting 3 days earlier. The surface had developed a rich patina that spoke of careful maturation. "I can hardly believe we made this ourselves," he said, running his finger along the edge of the cloth. "Never underestimate what you can accomplish when you approach a task with patience, attention to detail, and love," the Queen replied, carefully lowering the pudding into the steaming pot. "These qualities will serve you well in all aspects of your life." As their pudding began its final cooking, George helped his great-grandmother prepare the traditional accompaniments. They made brandy butter, whipping together sweet butter, powdered sugar, and a generous splash of brandy until it was light and fluffy. George took particular pleasure in this task, as the electric mixer created satisfying peaks and swirls in the rich mixture. "My mother taught me to make brandy butter when I was just a few years older than you are now," Queen Elizabeth shared as they worked. "She always said that the secret was to add the brandy slowly, a little at a time, so it would blend properly without curdling." They also prepared a warm custard sauce, stirring it carefully over low heat until it reached the perfect consistency. George learned the importance of constant stirring and patient temperature control, understanding that rushing this delicate process would result in disaster. "Cooking teaches us about so many things beyond food," the Queen observed as George mastered the custard stirring technique. "Patience, attention to detail, the reward that comes from careful work, the joy of creating something that brings pleasure to others. These are lessons that apply to every aspect of life." At noon, the extended royal family began gathering for Christmas lunch. George's parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins filled the elegant dining room with laughter and conversation. The formal table was set with the finest china and crystal, but the atmosphere was warm and familial rather than ceremonial. Throughout the elaborate meal, George found it difficult to concentrate on the succession of courses, each more delicious than the last. His mind kept returning to the kitchen, where their Christmas pudding was completing its final transformation. Would it live up to the family's expectations? Would they be able to taste the love and effort that had gone into its creation? Finally, as the main course plates were cleared away, Queen Elizabeth caught George's eye across the table and gave him a subtle nod. The moment had arrived. "If I may have everyone's attention," the Queen announced, rising from her place at the head of the table. "This year's Christmas pudding is particularly special, as it was made with the enthusiastic assistance of Prince George. I believe he would like to help present our dessert." George felt his cheeks flush with pride and nervousness as all eyes turned to him. Public speaking was something he was still learning to manage, but this felt different because he genuinely had something meaningful to share. Standing beside his great-grandmother, George cleared his throat and spoke with growing confidence. "Gon taught me that Christmas pudding is about much more than just food. Every ingredient has a story, and making it together connects us to our family's history and to each other." I hope you can taste all the love we put into it." The family responded with warm applause and encouraging smiles, and George felt a surge of pride at their positive reception. Chef Morrison appeared at that moment, carrying their magnificent pudding on an ornate silver platter, garnished with fresh holly and accompanied by the traditional flaming brandy presentation. The sight was spectacular. Their pudding, now perfectly warmed and gleaming under the dining room lights, looked like a work of art. The blue flames from the warmed brandy danced across its dark surface, creating a magical display that captured the wonder and tradition of Christmas. George and I are particularly proud of this pudding," Queen Elizabeth announced as Chef Morrison carefully extinguished the flames and began cutting generous portions. "It represents the continuation of a tradition that connects us to generations past and future." As each family member received their serving, accompanied by dollops of brandy butter and warm custard, George watched their faces anxiously. The first taste would reveal whether their weeks of careful work had produced the desired result. His grandfather, King Charles, took the first bite, and his expression immediately brightened with genuine pleasure. "This is extraordinary," he declared. "The flavor is incredibly rich and complex. George, you should be very proud of your contribution to our Christmas feast." Similar expressions of delight appeared around the table as other family members tasted the pudding. The texture was perfect, moist, and rich without being heavy, while the flavors had achieved that magical integration that marks a truly exceptional Christmas pudding. "It tastes like history," commented Princess, and thoughtfully, "I can taste all the tradition and care that went into making it." George beamed with pride as he savored his own portion. The pudding was everything they had hoped it would be, carrying within its rich flavors all the love, patience, and attention to detail they had invested in its creation. Queen Elizabeth, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand gently under the table. "Well done, George," she whispered. "You have contributed something beautiful and lasting to our family's Christmas celebration." As the afternoon progressed and the family lingered over their dessert and conversation, George reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The early morning in the kitchen seemed like a lifetime ago, yet every step of the process had led to this perfect conclusion. He realized that he had learned far more than how to make Christmas pudding. He had discovered the deep satisfaction that comes from creating something meaningful with his own hands, the importance of preserving family traditions, and the special bond that forms when knowledge and love are passed from one generation to another. Looking around the table at his family's happy faces, George understood that this Christmas would be remembered not just for the gifts exchanged or the games played, but for the moment when a young prince and his great-grandmother created something beautiful together, proving that the most precious traditions are those that connect us across generations through shared love and careful attention to the things that truly matter. The Christmas pudding was gone, but its legacy would endure in George's memory and in the tradition that would continue long into the future, passed from his hands to those who would come after him, carrying with it the same love, patience, and dedication that had made this Christmas day so special.